The year was 1822. It was a cold winter's night in New York City, December, and the snow was falling softly around the runners of a big black sleigh moving through the streets of the city. Wind whipped around the hunched figures of two men as the sleigh s***ed along through the snow. The two men were Dr. Clement Moore and his old Dutch handyman, Peter. Moore was tired. He was very tired. He'd been all over mid-Manhattan since the early part of the afternoon, delivering Christmas presents to his neighbors and his friends. Now the daylight was all just about gone, and Moore was eager to get home, but just a little uneasy about his arrival at home. Mrs. Moore had planned a Christmas party for that evening, and Dr. Moore had rashly promised his three children that he would entertain at the party with a little poem that he was going to write for the holiday. And now Moore was sorry that he had made the promise. What with delivering the presents, he hadn't had time to work on a poem, and Christmas poems weren't really in his line of work anyway. Dr. Moore was a scholar, a professor of Oriental languages in the General Theological Seminary of New York. Scholarship was more to his taste. As for the Christmas poem, well, maybe this time he might just have to disappoint the children. Moore looked over at Peter, sitting beside him in the sleigh. Peter had just let out a great sneeze, and his broad face and round body shook with the effort. Peter was using an immense handkerchief to blanket his nose, which had turned cherry red from the cold. His soft beard, white with snow, bobbed as he said,
"Not too long now, sir. Less than an hour and we'll be home."
And then Peter gestured toward the sky and added,
"A cold night, yes, but a fine one."
Moore looked up. Peter was right. It was a fine night. A full moon was out, bathing the trees and houses and road in a silvery light. How could I put it, thought Moore. Perhaps the moon on the breast of the new fallen snow gave the luster of midday to objects below. Not bad. Part of a poem, anyway. And with a kind of grumpy satisfaction, Moore filed it away in his memory. He watched as Peter whistled, then shouted to the horse. The sleigh flew swiftly over the winter snow. But, Moore thought, hardly fast enough. If only they could fly through the air, pulled by some strange creatures of winter. Reindeer, maybe. Reindeer would be wonderful. 8 strong reindeer. Then, thought Moore, Peter would spring to his sleigh, to his team give a whistle, and away they would fly like, that's like the down of a thistle. A mad dream, particularly since the sleigh seemed not to be going faster, but slower. "What's wrong, Peter?" said Moore. "Why are we stopping?" Peter jumped off the sled and called back,
"It's nothing, sir. Just a moment. Part of the harness has come loose from the single tree."
Moore watched as the old servant worked the strap back on the swinging bar, and as Peter crouched in the moonlight, the snow clinging to his beard, Moore had an inspiration. It seemed that Santa Claus was right there before him. In old Peter's face and figure, Moore sensed all of the goodness and warmth of Christmas. And so, working with Peter as his principal character, Moore continued to work on the poem all the way home. And then when he reached the house, he rushed into the study so that he could get it all down in pen and ink. It wasn't much, really, just a bit of doggerel. But Moore was certain that the children would enjoy it that evening. He was right. As he read his simple poem that night, the eyes of each child shone like the lights of the nearby Christmas tree. But what Clement Clark Moore didn't know that night so long ago was that his simple poem was destined for children yet unborn, children who would always listen with wide-eyed rapture whenever the opening lines were spoken.
'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. The children were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of sugar plums danced in their heads. And Mamma in her kerchief and I in my cap had just settled our brains for a long winter's nap, when out on the lawn there arose such a clatter, I sprang from my bed to see what was the matter. Away to the window I flew like a flash, tore open the shutters and threw up the sash. The moon on the breast of the new fallen snow gave the luster of midday to objects below, when what to my wondering eyes should appear but a miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeer, with a little old driver so lively and quick, I knew in a moment it must be St. Nick. More rapid than eagles his coursers they came, and he whistled and shouted and called them by name. Now Dasher, now Dancer, now Prancer and Vixen, on Comet, on Cupid, on Donder and Blitzen, to the top of the porch, to the top of the wall. Now dash away, dash away, dash away all. As dry leaves that before the wild hurricane fly, when they meet with an obstacle, mount to the sky, so up to the housetop the coursers they flew, with the sleigh full of toys, and St. Nicholas too. And then in a twinkling I heard on the roof the prancing and pawing of each little hoof. As I drew in my head and was turning around, down the chimney St. Nicholas came with a bound. He was dressed all in fur from his head to his foot, and his clothes were all tarnished with ashes and soot. A bundle of toys he had flung on his back, and he looked like a peddler just opening his pack. His eyes, how they twinkled! His dimples, how merry! His cheeks were like roses, his nose like a cherry. His droll little mouth was drawn up like a bow, and the beard on his chin was as white as the snow. The stump of a pipe he held tight in his teeth, and the smoke, it encircled his head like a wreath. He had a broad face, and a little round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. He was chubby and plump, a right jolly old elf, and I laughed when I saw him in spite of myself. A wink of his eye and a twist of his head soon gave me to know I had nothing to dread. He spoke not a word, but went straight to his work and filled all the stockings, then turned with a jerk, and laying his finger aside of his nose and giving a nod, up the chimney he rose. He sprang to his sleigh, to his team gave a whistle, and away they all flew like the down of a thistle. But I heard him exclaim, ere he drove out of sight, "Happy Christmas to all, and to all a good night."
In a little Austrian village long ago, a priest sat staring out into the darkness. The flame of a thick tallow candle on his desk flickering wildly. It was Christmas time in the year 1818, and the sun had long since dipped behind the frosted hills around the town of Oberndorf. Weariness, almost despondency, embraced the Reverend Joseph Moore. A serious problem tormented him. The village priest and organist Franz Gruber of the tiny church of St. Nicholas had spent days and days working out plans for a festive Christmas observance, and now it was out of the question. The church organ was broken, silent. Mice had destroyed the bellows. Not a creature was stirring. Those mice had been stirring. And now there wasn't any hope of repairing the organ, and just 6 hours remained to prepare a sermon for midnight mass, to try to pack the meaning of Christmas into a few words, and the words just wouldn't come. Father Moore was filled with despair about the broken organ and the Christmas service plans that were ruined, and now he couldn't even think of a meaningful sermon. Suddenly there was a sharp pounding at the door. The door burst open and a man stood there in the doorway with the snow mantling his shoulders. A mile up the mountain, he said, a young parishioner had given birth, and she wanted the child to be baptized at once. Wouldn't Father Moore come? Quickly, please? The priest reached wearily for his hat and coat. He knew it was going to take hours to make the trip. The narrow streets were choked with snowdrifts, and more snow was falling every minute. As Father Moore stepped out into the night, he breathed a silent prayer that his flock might find the message of Christmas in their own hearts. The journey seemed to take an eternity, but strangely, the sight of the proud, radiant mother and her new baby brought a curious peace to Father Moore. And as he tramped home through the drifting snow, his thoughts turned again and again to the serenity of the mother and the child he had seen. As he trudged along, in his mind, the words to a poem began to form. He thought maybe he could arrange them into a sermon, weighty with meaning, sturdy with rules and sound precepts. But it didn't want to work that way. It was a poem, and it wanted to stay a poem, and it kept forming itself in his mind. In fact, it was almost finished when he finally kicked the snow from his boots and sat down, rubbing his hands before the fire in his study. His friend, Franz Gruber, was waiting there for him, and as Father Moore scribbled the words of the poem onto a sheet of paper, he showed them to Franz. Gruber gripped Father Moore by the arm and said, "That would make a fine Christmas card." At midnight mass that evening, Father Moore forced his mind to follow the ritual, but again and again it turned to the distress he felt at failing the simple people of his parish. The priest had all but finished saying the Mass, when suddenly the thin sound of a guitar crept through the gathering of the still bowed figures, the sound moving toward the altar. It was the 12-stringed peasant guitar that belonged to Franz Gruber. And with that sound came the faltering voices of children, the children in the tiny church's choir. The voices uncertain at first, wavering, the young heads lit by one candle's flame. They sang the carol shyly at first, and then with gathering confidence, and as Father Moore listened, his burden lifted, his spirit soared. Franz Gruber had set his poem to music, and the children were singing it. The song would be his sermon. Father Moore didn't know it then, but his simple song was destined for the ages. Oh, but it did seem so right to him then. And as his hand rose in benediction over the heads of the children, the words echoed sweetly, clearly through the little church. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht, silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. It was late, on a bitterly cold, snowy New Year's Eve. A poor little girl was wandering in the dark, cold streets. She was bareheaded and barefooted. She certainly had shoes on when she left home, but they were not much good, for they were so huge. They had last been worn by her mother, and they fell off the poor little girl's feet when she was running across the street to avoid two carriages that were rolling rapidly by. One of the shoes could not be found at all, and the other was picked up by a boy who ran off with it, saying that it would do for a cradle when he had children of his own. So the poor little girl had to go on with her little bare feet, which were blue with the cold. She carried a quantity of matches in her old apron, and held a packet of them in her hand. Nobody had bought any from her during all the long day. Nobody had even given her a penny. The poor little creature was hungry and perishing with cold, and she looked the picture of misery. The snowflakes fell on her long yellow hair, which curled so prettily around her face, and she paid no attention to that. Lights were shining from every window, and there was a most delicious odor of roast goose in the streets, for it was New Year's Eve. She couldn't forget that. She found a protected place where one house projected a little beyond the next one, and here she crouched, drawing up her feet under her, but she was colder than ever. She did not dare go home, for she hadn't sold any matches and hadn't earned a single penny. Her father would beat her. Besides, it was almost as cold at home as it was here. They lived in a house where the wind whistled through every crack, although they tried to stuff up the biggest ones with rags and straw. Her tiny hands were almost paralyzed with cold. Oh, if she could only find some way to warm them. Dared she pull one match out of the bundle and strike it on the wall to warm her fingers? She pulled one out. Whoosh! How it spluttered, how it blazed. It burnt with a bright, clear flame, just like a little candle, and she held her hand around it. It was a very curious candle, too. The little girl fancied that she was sitting in front of a big stove with polished brass feet and handles. There was a splendid fire blazing in it and warming her so beautifully. But what happened? Just as she was stretching out her feet to warm them, the blaze went out, the stove vanished, and she was left sitting with the end of a burnt-out match in her hand. She struck a new one. It burnt, it blazed up, and where the light fell upon the wall against which she lay, it became transparent like gauze, and she could see right through it into the room inside. There was a table spread with a snowy cloth and pretty china. A roast goose stuffed with apples and prunes was steaming on it. And what was even better, the goose hopped from the dish with the carving knife and fork sticking in its back, and it waddled across the floor. It came right up to the poor child, and then the match went out, and there was nothing to be seen but the thick black wall. She lit another match. This time she was sitting under a lovely Christmas tree. It was much bigger and more beautifully decorated than the one she had seen when she had peeped through the glass doors at the rich merchant's house this Christmas Day. Thousands of lighted candles gleamed upon its branches, and colored pictures such as she had seen in the shop windows looked down upon her. The little girl stretched out both her hands towards them. Then out went the match. All the Christmas candles rose higher and higher, till she saw that they were only the twinkling stars. One of them fell and made a bright streak of light across the sky. Someone is dying, thought the little girl. For her old grandmother, the only person who had ever been kind to her, used to say, when a star falls, a soul is going up to God. Now she struck another match against the wall, and this time it was her grandmother who appeared in the circle of flame. She saw her quite clearly and distinctly, looking so gentle and happy. "Grandmother," cried the little creature, "oh, do take me with you. I know you will vanish when the match goes out. You will vanish like the warm stove, the delicious goose, and the beautiful Christmas tree." She hastily struck a whole bundle of matches because she did so want to keep her grandmother with her. The light of the matches made it as bright as day. Grandmother had never before looked so big or so beautiful. She lifted the little girl up in her arms, and they soared in a halo of light and joy, far, far above the earth, where there was no more cold, no hunger, no pain, for they were with God.
Mary, did you know that your baby boy would one day walk on water? Mary, did you know that your baby boy would save our sons and daughters? Did you know that your baby boy has come to make you new? This child that you've delivered will soon deliver you. Mary, did you know that your baby boy will give sight to a blind man? Mary, did you know that your baby boy will calm a storm with his hand? Did you know that your baby boy has walked where where angels trod. And when you kissed your little baby, then you kissed the face of God. Mary, did you know the blind will see, the deaf will hear, the dead will live again, the lame will leap, the dumb will speak, the praises of the Lamb. Mary, did you know that your baby boy is Lord of all creation? Mary, did you know that your baby boy will one day rule a nation? Did you know that your baby boy was heaven's perfect lamb? And the sleeping child you're holding, the great